You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inspired Change. I thought I'd do something a little bit different in this particular podcast, and that is that I want to contextualize some of my work. And there has been, as you know, a movement in the sense that I've been working on called Making Good Men Great. And it was a process that really came together from my clinical work with men and my sort of social experience of masculinity and men in general, both in the workplace but also socially. And it's been a process, a labour of love over, several decades that's been crystallising my thinking on a number of levels. In fact, it's not just about the psychology of men or the well-being of men and what masculinity means to all of us. But it's been a process wherein I've needed to dig deep into my own heart and soul, my own psyche in many respects, and acknowledge some issues. But it's also been there to look at how to help men come out of a highly toxic socialization process that's disallowed men from being who they could really be in their lives with themselves, their partners, and then in their community, including their careers. So through that process, through the movement and my coaching processes and my clinical work, I've been doing a lot of writing. And I've written a book, Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity. I'm looking in the future to put in a second edition of that book. But I'm also working with a friend of mine on a book titled The Man Con. And I'm not going to touch on that too much in this particular podcast. At some point, Mark and I will sit down together and have a sort of chat together about sharing what it is that we're doing with, you guys out there and seeing, maybe getting some feedback and so on. But what I want to talk about in today's episode is that one of the other elements that I've been very passionate about is creating a documentary that looks into essentially where we as men are currently at and how we got there. And I titled it The Crisis of Man, and it's essentially a social documentary film about what it is to be a man, okay? In this particular part of the 21st century, we men, our community, our society, our culture is looking at issues that we thought we might have put into the past, but they've come back to bite us big time. The 20th century consolidated a cultural gender revolution that fundamentally began with Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century, calling for the emancipation of women. And it's led then to the suffragette movement and then to the modern feminist movement. And no, feminism predominantly is not the enemy of man. The whole project's about equality. Women weren't setting out to dominate and control men, but rather, be able to take their place alongside men. Now, for the most part, this has been a highly successful social evolution for most Western women. However, it's also created a cultural gender divergence that's had some significant ramifications for men. And my argument is partly because we've been rather inflexible about how we see ourselves and what we call masculinity. And the only way to really get to the nuts and bolts of it is to accept that what we've experienced is a particular ideological socialization called patriarchy. So the question that we want to really address in this social documentary is what's really happened to men? how have men fared in this monumental change of gender in our society? And I think it's been monumental, but it's been, you know, on the one hand underplayed, on the other hand, it's been people have tried to control it. Religions have come into play with it. Who've been essentially patriarchal and have always wanted to keep women in a socially submissive position. Now, to me, in many respects, the answer is actually frighteningly simple. And that is, if I look at men and masculinity right now, then I would argue that we're in a crisis. And that actually has led to a crisis in many different spheres of social, cultural, and institutional environments. So the question is, why are we men in crisis? And I'd argue, and I'm going to try and portray this with my wonderful team at Entertainment, that there's been many, many reasons. But let's look at just a few of those. So if I go into the social identity of genders, then between men and women, okay, I'm not talking about sex, I'm talking about gender, there has been a massive change in roles and expectations of men. Some of which are good, some of which are not so good. And there's also been fundamentally a backlash to that. It's almost like the red and blue pill phenomenon. There has also been, during this period of time, a significant change in life expectancy and the impact that has on later life for both men and women, but especially, we're talking about men. One of the big problems in that area is that as men, we don't like to openly discuss our health, whether it's physical or mental health, and how we're feeling. And it's not just feeling, it's about feeling about these things. And one of the things that I had to deal with very early on in the piece, in my journey with men, is that a lot of the guys that I was working with were completely reluctant to take any form of action when they didn't feel physically or mentally well. To the point where I remember dealing with someone who shared with me that he'd been, a bit worried because he had blood in his urine. And I went, you need to go to the doctor like right now. I mean, it would have been preferable if you would have gone the moment this started, but you didn't. Let's go now. And he basically took the position that, well, it'll resolve. It's not really a problem. Let's just take a few weeks, and see whether it settles down. And I went, well, no, as far as I'm concerned, you need to go now. The other part of it is that, in amongst it all, men are also generally engaged in risky activities that tend to threaten their health. And interestingly enough, and I watch this with boys, for whatever odd reason, and it's not genetic, believe me, a lot of boys are very, very bad risk managers. Now, I could argue that's the case with girls too, but we seem to get ourselves into a lot more strife. I always make the sort of observation that when it came to my son, we had frequent flyer points at the local emergency department of the hospital. Now, in addition to all of that, one of the key problems we're having is that we still have a significant stigma surrounding mental health. And the interesting thing is that I've seen men really step up to being there for other men, but they're still reluctant to put their hand up for help themselves. So in this particular social documentary, we're also going to be talking about, some scientific studies, particularly about men in Australia, but also in the UK and the US, and arguing that fundamentally our society, our culture is actually failing boys and men in many respects. We have some really problematic drug and alcohol problems. And in fact, when I look at the suicide statistics, or when I'm working with teenagers and young men who are suicidal, a lot of their suicidality is attached to their alcohol and drug use. You take the alcohol and drug use out of it, and the suicidality seems to disappear, or at least is significantly reduced. So all this, and we're going to be painting a picture basically around this, raises the critical question: why are we as men in this problematic place? And more importantly, how did we get there? Because in order to understand how we're going to get out of it, we need to understand how we got here. And so, the documentary, I want to take the viewer through a journey through time to the present day, to examine what it means historically, anthropologically, sociologically, psychologically, and economically about what it's like to be a man, and where this notion of masculinity originates, how it presents itself now, and what it may mean for the future in this century. Part of this process is to create a meaningful explanation about patriarchy and masculinity, past and present. And it really challenges many of the sacred cows that are abundant in this sphere of discussion. I mean, one of the classics that I always sort of get a bit of a kick out of is when men talk about, they are the provider and women are the protector of the hearth and so on. And, we go out there and hunt buffalo and bring the buffalo home. Well, anthropologically and historically, that's a nonsense. And, especially when people start talking about how this is genetically defined. So we're gonna explode some sacred cows in this. And the way we're going to do it is we're really going to take a look at the whole topic through the lens of science as well as the humanities. It really goes into defining patriarchy and its impact on masculinity in a very straightforward way, in an understandable way. You talk to most guys about patriarchy and they sort of glaze over and see it as an exposition that comes from feminism, which we collectively at times relate to as the enemy, which it is not. I'll keep repeating this. So I've defined in Making Good Men Great that fundamentally patriarchy rests on four values. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts. I'm not necessarily going to spend a lot of time here. What I do want to say is that the documentary goes into this whole thing about the masculine ideals that we hold as socialized, and they are inherently not genetic or in our nature as we sort of talk about it. Fundamentally, what has influenced a lot of ideas about gender is social Darwinism. So that's going to be one of our main critiques, is that we've been forced into a way of seeing ourselves that's both toxic, unhealthy, and fundamentally destructive to not just the individual, but our culture and our society. Biological determinism will not get us out of this place, arguing that this is akin to, the reptilian brain and all that sort of stuff. And I can go into it in another podcast. In fact, I will talk about the myth of the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain from a neuroscience point of view, because I find that stuff really interesting, and we're going to include that in the documentary. There are, again, these common myths about how men are that are based purely on this social Darwinian ideas and biological determinism that provide a serious rationale for the place for male dominance, but that those ideas leave men, in many respects, confused in the current gender landscape or cultural landscape. Now, a lot of men are catching on and going, hang on a minute, I don't want to live the way, previous generations of men have lived because it doesn't seem to serve us or me very well. So I want to get across in this documentary that, men are as much a victim of the patriarchal ideology and its socialization as are women and children. We're not the bad guys. There are some of us who do bad things, but collectively, that's not the case. The use of real people and common situations is also going to be a really strong part to this documentary, the social documentary. I want to focus in the episodes, some of the episodes, on the lived experience of men and the process of change that men have engaged in to throw off the shackles of traditional masculinity, the patriarchal rubbish that we've been indoctrinated with, including what we tend to think is scientific knowledge and what in fact is what someone appropriately called neuro trash. I love that term. It's got so much meaning to it. So we're going to look at the whole range of patriarchy, its impact on masculinity, and how to deconstruct that to begin to look forward to constructing a healthier idea about what masculinity is really about. And so, I'm hoping that we're going to illuminate that there is indeed a male role identity or masculine paradigm that boys and men can become that is healthier than what we've had. Patriarchy, traditional masculinity comes at a tremendous personal and social cost. And we need to recognize that. We're living through the throes of a patriarchal backlash at the moment. We're seeing strong men trying to take hold of, politics and nations and empire building and, throwing out progressive ideas of equality, democracy, respect. And it's scary. We're seeing, places like the United States, leaning heavily into a theocracy, a sort of, a religious fascism, completely undermining, the rights of women in particular, but also imposing rules and conditions on how men should be. And men are reacting. It's no accident that the United States sees an enormous amount of gun violence, and the sort of, using the instruments of fear and domination and control from a place of which men are in fact fearful, and they're just trying to compensate. But it's so destructive. So I thought I'd give you a bit of a taste about what we're looking to do in this documentary called Crisis of Man. And I think it's an important project. I think it's going to have, hopefully, some really constructive and positive impact. And yes, I have every anticipation that people are going to troll us and get into our faces about how this is all, liberal or progressive rubbish and clash trap and blah, 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 blah. Because let's face it, the conservative movements in many places in the world have actually gone into, the extreme ultra-right. Someone said on a YouTube video, it's the, Western version of the Taliban. And that's scary, folks. We have a country like Russia talking about, resorting to nuclear weapons in order to get their way. And that is, unfortunate. And it is an extension of that patriarchal ideology. I mean, let me put very bluntly, Putin's been very busy creating and constructing the traditional masculine stereotype with his shirt off and sitting on a horse. That sort of conceited, malignant narcissism, has its roots in the masculine exceptionalism of patriarchy. So, until next time, I'm going to be signing off now. So, hopefully, this has given you a bit of a taste about what we're working on and what's coming up in the near future. And any comments, please, get back to us. We'd be happy to take a look at it. We'd be happy to have a discussion around it. But as always, it needs to be respectful and it needs to be considerate. Otherwise, that discussion is not going to happen. I don't engage with bullying, harassment, or trolling. So just as a heads up, social etiquette needs to be maintained. I don't care which side of the fence you're on, politically, ideologically, religiously, whatever. And until next time, this is me signing off. Consider change. Consider your turning points towards being good and great and influencing the corner of the world that you live in and participate in and not exploited.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.